Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural webinar of the 2018 Our Homes, Our Votes campaign here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as a housing advocacy organizer here at the Coalition. In anticipation of this year's elections, we're conducting a series of 6 webinars to provide clear information to assist organizations looking to engage low-income renters in the electoral process. We believe that showing elected officials that housing is an important elections issue will be essential to advancing policies at the federal, state, and local levels. Before we get started, I'd like to take a quick moment to go over a few logistical details for today's webinar. We will allow time for questions at the end of today's presentation. If you have questions at any point, please type them into the Q&A box in the right-hand side of your screen. Access to both a video recording and presentation slides from today's webinar will be provided following today's events. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties, please send an email to Trey Walk at outreachintern@nlihc.org. I am joined today by Diane Yentl and Shyam Subramanian. Diane is the President and CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition and is a veteran affordable housing policy expert and advocate with nearly 2 decades of work on affordable housing and community development issues. Shyam is Southern California Counsel for the Boulder Advocacy Program at the Alliance for Justice, and he assists nonprofit organizations in pursuing legal and effective advocacy to advance their public policy goals. On the agenda for today's webinar, we'll begin by introducing the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, give an overview of voter suppression efforts, discuss factors that nonprofits should take into account when getting involved in voter engagement, and close by responding to questions and highlighting additional resources. With that, I'll turn it over to Diane.
Great, thank you. You can go ahead and advance that. Thanks. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you on the first in a series of 6 webinars on Our Homes, Our Votes. And Our Homes, Our Votes is our effort at the National Low Income Housing Coalition to increase voter registration and turnout among low-income people and their advocates and allies. And we plan to do this work through education, voter registration, and mobilization. So why are we doing this work? We're doing it basically because policymakers care most about voters. So, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, Independents, or some other party, it's not constituents that drive their decisions most, as many often say, but it's voting constituents. And until low-income renters vote at equal to or greater numbers than high-income homeowners do, low-income rental housing issues just won't be a top priority for policymakers. It's really that simple. And at NLIHC, our members and our partners, like all of you who've joined us today, are really in a unique position to amplify the voices and to help low-income renters register and get out to vote. Basically, when low-income renters lack a strong presence at the polls, we have unfavorable housing policy decisions. But when low-income voters become a powerful voting bloc, that's when really big change becomes possible. So this is what we're up against. This is what the differences look like between renters and homeowners and who's voting. On this table here, you can see in 2016, about 67% of homeowners voted compared to less than half of renters. And when you do it by income, the discrepancy is even starker. In that same year in 2016, households with incomes over $100,000, nearly 3/4 of them voted, and less than 40% of very low or extremely low income households voted. So this is what we're up against. Changing this equation is essential. It's just really foundational to achieving our goals of ending homelessness and ending housing poverty. So that's what Our Homes, Our Votes is all about. These webinars and the materials that we'll make available through them, which Justin will talk about a little bit later, are meant to help all of you join us in this critical work so that you can make civic engagement part of the work that you do every day and ultimately we can all achieve our goal of ending homelessness and housing poverty. So thanks again for joining us. We're really excited to have you along with us in this important work, and I'll go ahead and turn it back to Justin now.
All right, so that's going to lead us into our conversation about voter suppression. And voter suppression is an issue that the people we advocate with are encountering more frequently. So I'd like to spend a few moments discussing what it is and why it's important to be aware of. Generally, voter suppression refers to policies and actions aimed at creating barriers for people to participating in elections. And often this is done with the goal of influencing both the outcomes of the elections and the policy that comes in the long run. On this map, which comes to us via the Brennan Center for Justice, we have displayed states which have enacted restrictive voting policies since 2010. Overall, 23 states have more restrictive voting procedures, with 13 states having added restrictive voter ID laws, 11 enacting laws making it harder for citizens to register, 6 cutting back on early voting days and hours, and 3 having made it harder to restore voting rights for people with past criminal convictions. So what do voter suppression activities look like? One of the most infamous examples is the voter ID law, which requires voters to get specific identification that is often difficult and time-consuming to obtain. There is also voter caging, which seeks to challenge a voter's eligibility to vote and ultimately purges voters based on undeliverable mail. Caging has most recently been observed in North Carolina during the 2016 elections, where 3 counties were found guilty of systematically purging between 3,500 and 4,000 voters from their registration rolls. Since 2011, 11 states, including North Carolina, Florida, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nebraska, have reduced their early voting periods and made it more difficult to do so. Many southern states, such as Texas, Arizona, South Carolina, Mississippi, and Alabama, have closed at least 868 polling places since the U.S. Supreme Court struck down portions of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. Finally, there are misinformation campaigns which target specific communities in regards to voting. A recent example includes an effort in Virginia during the 2017 gubernatorial election, in which a Twitter account tweeted graphics instructing voters how to vote by text using their phone. Ultimately, the reason why we should be most concerned with these efforts is the large overlap between the groups of people these programs are designed to disenfranchise and the people who are likely to be low-income people and renters. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sham, who's going to discuss legal considerations.
Thanks, Justin. So hi, everyone. My name is Sham Subramanian, and I'm with the Boulder Advocacy Program of Alliance for Justice. So a little bit about Alliance for Justice. We are an association of over 130 organizations across the country. And part of our organization focuses on advocacy around the federal courts. And right now we're focusing on the Supreme Court nomination. But I'm with our Boulder Advocacy Program. And our Boulder Advocacy Program provides trainings, both webinar and in-person trainings across the country, technical assistance, and also plain language, fact sheets, and in-depth publications on rules related to nonprofit advocacy. So if you have any questions that I'm not able to get to today or you think of later, you can always email us at advocacy@afj.org or call us at 1-866-NP-LOBBY. We have an attorney on call Monday through Friday to answer questions. And while we are attorneys, we can't provide legal advice or represent your organization, but we can direct you to the right resource or walk you through the relevant rule and provide legal information. And we really try to focus on providing practical tips and best practices for nonprofits to encourage them to do more advocacy and also to do more nonpartisan civic engagement work. And our website is boulderadvocacy.org. So the federal tax code prohibits 501c3 organizations from supporting or opposing candidates for public office. This is a strict prohibition. And while there have been some proposals in Congress to repeal or partially repeal this prohibition as it relates to religious organizations, the law is currently that 501c3s cannot support or oppose candidates. And the way that the IRS would determine whether a particular activity or communication is intended to or is supporting or opposing a candidate is based on all the facts and circumstances. So I really want to offer some practical tips for you all to be able to talk about housing, to be able to educate voters and educate candidates also, but to do so in a nonpartisan way. So what does that look like? Well, first of all, 501c3s can register voters. As I mentioned, they can educate voters and candidates, and they can even encourage voters to get out and vote. But they cannot make endorsements of any political candidates. They can't donate money or resources or staff time to any particular candidate. And for those of you who are employees of a 501c3, you have to make sure that any of your partisan activities are done so in your individual capacity, in your own time. So if you're volunteering on a campaign, for example, making sure that you're not, sending out campaign emails while you're at work, or making phone calls using your work phone, or using your work facilities to talk about canvassing for that candidate. So you want to make sure that you're maintaining a separation. And even when you're communicating with the public, making sure that they know that you're doing so in your individual capacity, especially for those of you who may be executive directors or in senior leadership. Disclaimers can help, saying, I'm here in my individual capacity, or when you're making an endorsement, making clear that you're doing so in your individual capacity. So now I want to talk about permissible activities for 501c3s. So how can you highlight the importance of housing, and how can you make sure that these issues are considered by candidates and voters? I'm going to talk about issue advocacy, candidate education, and voter engagement. When you're doing issue advocacy, it's important to focus on the issue involved and not the candidate. So even if you are criticizing an incumbent, a sitting elected official on a particular issue, you want to focus on why the policy is harmful, not attack the personal characteristics of that individual elected official, or talk about why they're unfit for office. So if a certain proposal related to housing is harmful to communities that you represent and work with, then making sure to focus on the impacts of that policy or the impacts of the statement involved. It's also helpful to have a track record of advocacy on the issue. That's helpful to show that your reason for getting involved or for talking about this issue is because it's core to your organization's mission. And this is proven by the fact that you've done advocacy work on this even outside of an election year. Also, the timing is important. So as much as possible, it's a best practice to time your communications to non-election events. For example, there's a hearing on a housing-related issue, or let's say there's a scheduled vote on an issue, and that's why you're releasing a particular statement. So it's helpful when it's timed to a non-election event, not, one day before the election, you start to talk about a particular issue. And all the facts and circumstances are important. So to look at the example on the right side, vote for housing, is this an issue that clearly divides two candidates in the race? Is it clear who you're referring to when you say vote for housing? Is this part of an ongoing communication or an ongoing series of activities by the organization? That can be helpful to show that's really about the issue and not about supporting any particular candidate. And then are you releasing this message to all the communities that you work with, or are you releasing it only in swing districts? Or are you releasing it only to independent voters? So those are all facts and circumstances that would likely be taken into account by the IRS to determine whether or not this communication is issue advocacy, or is it actually trying to support or oppose a candidate? Also, 501c3 public charities are permitted to support or oppose ballot measures. It's not considered supporting or opposing a candidate. So this is lobbying activity to the IRS, and so you would need to be able to track and report your lobbying activity to the IRS and stay within IRS lobbying limits. If you have more questions about lobbying, that's something that we can definitely answer and help with. You can email us at advocacy@asj.org again, and we have some resources on our website at boulderadvocacy.org. But nonprofits, again, 501c3 public charities can say, we support this ballot measure, we oppose this ballot measure. It's also important to make sure that these activities are nonpartisan. So that means not coordinating your messaging or your strategy with a political party or a specific candidate. So the next activity I want to talk about is candidate education. 501c3s are permitted to educate candidates on particular issues, and it's important to do so because candidates have their own experiences and perspectives, and they may not know a lot about the issues that you have expertise in. So the best practice here is to offer any briefing materials or educational information to all candidates in the race, regardless of whether you think they would agree with the conclusions or whether they would even read it. It's important to offer and distribute it to all candidates in the race. It's also important to use what's already gathered and not prepare specific information or talking points upon request from a candidate. So if you're giving information to a candidate or if you're creating new information, you should have an organizational reason for doing so, not only because a candidate has asked you to do research into a certain topic or prepare talking points specifically for that candidate's platform. So what about voter education? Public charities can educate voters in a number of ways. One approach is a candidate questionnaire, and we have fact sheets on how to do this in a nonpartisan way. But generally speaking, your questionnaires should be distributed to all candidates in the race, and you should ask open-ended questions. So what would you do regarding the housing situation as opposed to would you support X policy or Y policy? How would you address homelessness, for example, as opposed to asking them to take a pledge? The IRS has said that 501c3s may not ask candidates to take pledges to support or oppose a particular policy or program, but you can certainly encourage them or provide information. But in the questionnaires, it's important to ask open-ended questions. Also, 501c3s can host candidate forums. It's important to invite all viable candidates in the race, and similar principles apply to a candidate questionnaire. Ask open-ended questions. Also, as much as possible, try to touch on a broad range of issues. So if you're a housing organization, maybe partner with other types of organizations, environmental organizations or immigration organizations. Or you can also, within housing, touch on a number of different housing-related issues. Maybe there's some issues related to transit. Maybe there's some issues related to domestic violence. So those are all best practices when you're hosting a candidate forum or distributing a candidate questionnaire. And also, because I'm a lawyer, I like to say that disclaimers are helpful. So, you know, in your candidate questionnaire or at the beginning of the forum, letting people know that this is nonpartisan, this is intended for educational purposes only, can be helpful both for the candidate to know and also for members of the public. So what about voter registration and get out the vote? 501c3s can register voters and encourage people to vote, but should do so in a nonpartisan way. So what does that mean? First of all, it's important not to suggest that people vote for a particular candidate or register with a particular party. If people ask for information, you can direct them to a nonpartisan, objective source of information, like Secretary of State's website, for example, if they want to know what the different parties stand for example. The service should be available to all individuals, all eligible individuals, and you shouldn't turn away people, you know, just because you may not like the party that they might register with. And if you're focusing on certain areas for get out the vote, you should use nonpartisan criteria. For example, we're working in this neighborhood because we have programs in this neighborhood, or we've done a lot of trainings on other topics in this neighborhood, and that's why we're doing get out the vote here. But you shouldn't use criteria like we're going to focus on Democrats and ask them to get out the vote, or we're going to focus on swing voters. But other examples of nonpartisan criteria are we're focusing on low-income voters or other groups underrepresented at the polls, for example, youth. Again, it's important not to use criteria that are intended to influence the outcome of the election in the sense of trying to elect a specific candidate or a specific party. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Justin, who can talk about some of the legal considerations for federally funded organizations.
One moment. All right. So in terms of voter engagement activities, federally funded organizations such as public housing authorities are able to participate in voter registration activities. However, there are a few specific restrictions that they must be aware of. First off, staff who are paid either through the AmeriCorps or the Head Start programs cannot participate in registration activities. However, they are able to participate in nonpartisan voter education activities such as letting folks know how and when to vote. The second bullet here refers to any group which receives funding from the Legal Services Corporation, such as legal aid and legal action groups. And these groups cannot participate in any election activities whatsoever. Finally, this last point refers to community action agencies and generally means that these groups can participate in engagement activities, but must be sure to not do so with community services block grant funding. And there's more information at the link at the bottom so for some more specifics on those restrictions. And now we're ready for questions. Just a reminder that if you have a question, to please type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. I also want to introduce Tori Beret, who is also a housing advocacy organizer and will be assisting us with this portion of the webinar.
Great, thank you. So again, just a reminder to please type any questions in the lower right corner where the chat box is. We do have one comment just stating that there's also an issue having an appropriate mailing address to vote by mail for folks. So, but I don't see any additional questions at the moment. Oh, there's a question about, is there any state level data for voter participation as it pertains to those living in rentals or low income voters?
So this is Diane. So it's a great question. I don't believe that there is that combination of information in any one place. One thing that the National Low Income Housing Coalition has and can make available to people is our housing preservation database, which is a database of all affordable housing units throughout the country. And that can be useful, and we actually have a webinar where we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how people can use that data to help with voter registration and mobilization efforts, essentially to know in your community where are the low-income affordable rental units where you could focus your organizing and registration mobilization efforts. But in terms of combining that information with voter registration information, I don't believe that exists. I have had several conversations with other local and national people who bring this up consistently as a clear and obvious need for these efforts. And I think there's some conversations underway that we and others are having with some groups like League of Women Voters and others who have some information, and we have additional information to think about how we might combine that and make that available to people to use in their efforts.
Great. There's another question about states. Can you explain in a little more detail about how to present information on candidates and their platform on housing without advocating on behalf or against either candidate?
Sure, I can take that. I think the best approach is to distribute a candidate questionnaire to candidates, asking them various questions. and allowing them to respond in their own words without just saying, do you support this, yes or no? So if, for example, what would you do to support people experiencing homelessness? That allows them to provide their solutions, and then that information should just be presented to the public. Maybe you can set a word count for both candidates, so you're presenting that information in the same way. You're not selectively editing the answers or formatting in a way to highlight one over the other. So that would be an ideal approach, is to just get their answers in their own words and then present that information to the voters in the form of a voter guide, for example.
Great. There's another question. Can you please explain in more detail what exactly constitutes as an objective source of information to learn more about the candidates and parties when registering voters?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, for example, if people want a list of the candidates running, then I know in California, the Secretary of State's website will have the most up-to-date information, and that might be different in different states. So if it's a question like that, a government website might have the most accurate information. As far as where does a candidate stand on a particular issue? If you don't have a voter guide yourself, then you can direct them to the candidates' websites where they have that information, and hopefully will have their policy platforms on their website.
Great. There's another question. It says, what regulations exist regarding asking local political parties for voter database information, such as getting reports for specific areas that show voter turnout?
You can check in the closed captioning and scroll up if you want.
So I don't know if anyone else has any information on this, but that's not something I know about, so I don't know what rules surround that.
Yeah, I don't have the answer to that offhand either, but we do have a webinar. I think it's either our third or fourth where we'll have some guest speakers addressing that issue.
Mm-hmm. There's a question about how should 501c3 organizations interact with advocacy organizations that are allowed to engage in more partisan activity. Should this be completely avoided?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let's say you're working with a 501c4 or a union. Those organizations actually can support or oppose candidates or political parties. So you need to make sure that any joint activities you do with those organizations are nonpartisan. So for example, if you're working on a ballot measure with them, then you need to make sure that that effort is not being done in coordination with a party or any particular campaign. And if it is, then the 501c3 can't be a part of that coalition effort. But they can certainly work with them on nonpartisan activities, that is, activities that are not trying to support a party or oppose a party or a candidate. Also, I'll say that if you are working with those organizations on, say, a ballot measure, you have to be aware that 501c3 public charities are limited in how much lobbying they can do, whereas 501c4s or unions don't face that same limit.
Great. That is it so far for questions. There's one about our additional webinars coming up.
Yes, and I will be talking about that in a few moments.
So this question says, do you have recommendations about what we should be doing between now and the next webinar to get ready to launch the campaign?
Yes, and I'm actually going to talk about a few resources that we have at the coalition in the next few slides that you can look at as well.
Great. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Justin.
Awesome. So I'd like to take a moment, as I said, to just kind of go over a few resources that we hope that you will find useful as you prepare to get your strategies together for the next couple of months. In terms of legal tools, both the Alliance for Justice and Nonprofit Vote have initiatives aimed at ensuring nonprofit organizations have the knowledge and resources for engaging with voters and navigating complex advocacy rules. Both are great places to go for more information on all the topics discussed today. Additionally, and this sort of gets at the question that was just asked, here at the Coalition, we've developed both a voter engagement guide and engagement plan. The guide describes why we feel that nonprofits are most suited to engaging with low-income voters and advocates, and the plan gives a checklist of considerations that nonprofits can use when developing their own engagement strategy. Additionally, we're getting ready to launch our Homes, Our Votes website, which will serve as a home for all of the resources and guidance that we have in terms of voter engagement.
Your window, there might be another screen hidden.
A few other organizations that offer great resources include the Brennan Center for Justice, which works to make sure that voting is fair, free, and accessible for all Americans through tracking and publishing analyses of voting rights policies in every state. The Fair Elections Legal Network is a national nonpartisan organization which fights barriers to registration in typically underrepresented constituencies. They maintain state-specific resources regarding registration deadlines, ID requirements, and how to vote early or by mail in each state, which may get at one of the questions that was asked earlier in the webinar. Vote411.org is the online voter education resource of the League of Women Voters and provides voter registration tools such as nationwide polling place lookup and ballot guides for voters in every state. Finally, the National Coalition for the Homeless maintains the You Don't Need a Home to Vote campaign, which seeks to promote voting among people experiencing homelessness. The site offers resources on how homeless people can register and vote in each state, how homeless services agencies can incorporate registration activities into their client intake process, and more. Here are the remaining webinars for the Our Homes, Our Vote series. Our next webinar will focus on how organizations can develop effective voter registration programs and discuss key considerations for conducting registration at community events, door-to-door registration campaigns, and working registration activities into day-to-day organizational operations. NLIHC is a membership-based organization, and programs such as today's webinar are made possible through financial contributions of our members. Our members constitute a network of housing and social justice advocates committed to ending homelessness and housing poverty in America. We welcome members at any contribution amount affordable to them, so please consider becoming a member today. Thank you again for attending today's webinar, and we hope to see you on July 24th, and have a great afternoon.
Only 36 minutes. Not even an hour. Great. That's nice.